All right, this week in our seminary pacing, we're in sections 94 through 97 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Now, you'll notice that section 95 has quite a bit of meat to it, but 94, 96, and 97, not quite as much. So I started doing a really close study of section 94 to try to find some principles. And I found one that I just thought was so helpful to discuss with my class, so I wanted to share it with you. Let me show you my PowerPoint here. Here's what I used. I'm going to assume that you already have the context and the content set up for these, and here we are going to identify a principle. So in the context, you'll learn that 3 houses need to be built, one the temple, one for the prophets, and one the scriptures. And so I would have, at this point, jumped into these verses with the students. You'll notice in verse 2 of section 94 that the Lord says that these houses will be built after a pattern. Now that pattern is illustrated in verse 4 and verse 11 of section 94, and then in verse 15 of section 95. And that pattern is simply the dimensions of the house, of these houses he's calling it, which is that they'll be built 55 by 65 feet, each one of them. So there'll be these buildings that all look the same. So here's the principle that I teach to my students. Instead of them finding one in here, I just teach them one, and it is, each of these houses was to be built with the exact same dimensions. This could suggest that we should strive to have the temple, the prophets, and the scriptures as regular parts of our spiritual development. Now, what I do here is a practice that I commend to you for a lot of important reasons, and that is that we're going to analyze it in the context of the scriptures. What we might be tempted to do is take this truth that I just put up there and immediately go into their lives. That can work, but there also seems to be great power in analyzing it in the context of the scriptures. There's lots of reasons. One of them is, if we do it in the context of the scriptures, then we can use the scriptures themselves to analyze it for those people. Another reason might be because we're talking about something sensitive, and instead of immediately taking a truth and trying to make the students get really personal with it, we could continue to struggle with it in the context of the people for whom it was written or given. For example, Laman and Lemuel have some negative characteristic, and instead of coming up and saying, we have that too, let's talk about our negativity, there seems to be some hesitancy maybe with students I found to do that because they're not quite ready to talk about their own negativity. But if we keep it within the context of Laman and Lemuel, they don't mind picking, so to speak, on Laman and Lemuel and analyzing them in their own context. So this is a powerful tool that I found in my teaching that really helps. So you see me doing that here by saying, what value do you see in reminding the saints in Kirtland of the importance of emphasizing each of these houses in their lives? And that'll give them some time to talk about it. Here's another one that I have. The next slide would be, what challenge do you think might have developed in Kirtland if one of these houses was left unbuilt? And you probably know, in fact, there were houses that were left unbuilt. That's part of the section of 95. They haven't even started on the temple, let alone the house of the prophets or the scriptures. This gives us some chance to analyze that. Now, the next one, I'm starting to get them to move into feeling the importance and truth of these things. Hopefully you're studying your Gospel Teaching and Learning Handbook to figure out what that all means. But here they are. When we start to talk about ourselves, now they might not need this. Your students might immediately start talking about themselves and how it's applicable. But this would be a good slide to let them go ahead and prime that process by thinking about the house where I spend the most time in spiritual construction and why it's been a blessing. Now I've hid this slide. For my Institute students, they don't always need as much priming. So I just said, which of these houses is the one you spend most of your time in spiritual construction? And immediately they could say, I read the scriptures more than I go to the temple or the words of the prophets. Now, that's not bad that they're going to the scriptures regularly, but we want them to help them to develop houses with equal dimensions, so to speak. So after they've had a chance to share those things, I would put up this slide. We each need to improve our activity with at least one of these important houses. And what would you suggest to a person who was interested in knowing how to begin building a house of scriptures, the prophets, and the temple? This would be more moving into that applying gospel truths to come up with ideas about how to start or where to start with building them. Now, you'll probably find that some students are more heavy on the scriptures or the prophets of the temple, so they can speak to the other students using this type of activity about how they have built this house of power in their life. I hope you find great success in this and other principles that you teach in sections 94 through 97. Don't hesitate to reply to an email or send an email out to everybody with fantastic teaching tips and successes you've had teaching these and other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, good luck this week.